My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and the last thing I expected to hear from my only daughter, the girl I raised with aching hands and sleepless nights, was, "You're just a burden now." She said it while setting down her wine glass, barely looking up from her phone. As if her words were dust she could flick away without consequence. I remember the way the stem of that glass caught the light from the chandelier. Everything else in the room blurred. I didn't speak. I couldn't, because my heart wasn't just broken. It was replaced, like it had never mattered. The truth is, when you've lived long enough, you learn that betrayal doesn't always come with a scream. Sometimes it lands like a whisper in the middle of your kitchen over the soft clink of glass and the hum of an air purifier. I had moved in with my daughter Natalie 2 years after her divorce. She said she needed help with the kids, with the house, with life. I came without hesitation. That's what mothers do. I gave up my quiet little condo in Vermont where the air smelled like pine and the silence felt like peace. I left behind my garden, my books, my friends. I traded it all for stacked dishes, chaotic mornings, and the cold distance of a daughter who once used to braid my hair when I was sick. In the beginning, she thanked me. She made tea for me every evening. She kissed my cheek. But slowly those gestures shrank into nods, then into silence, then into sighs, until this morning. I had simply reminded her that the washing machine was leaking again, and that the kids' lunches were missing fruit. Simple, caring observations, the way I always offered care. But she didn't want care. She wanted compliance. Her voice sharpened. "If you don't like it here, you don't have to stay. You know, you're not contributing anymore. You're kind of a burden now, not contributing anymore." The words spun in my ears like wind chimes made of broken glass. She had no idea. She had no idea that the house she lived in had once been saved by me. That years ago, when she was fresh into her marriage and struggling with loan approvals, it was my account, my savings, the ones I never talked about that filled the gap. I never told her. I didn't think I needed to. Is that what parenthood becomes? Quiet erasure. You give, and one day you're invisible. I sat there still. I didn't defend myself. I didn't cry. Instead, I asked, "Would you like me to find somewhere else to stay?" She shrugged. "If it's not working, then maybe that's best." It wasn't rage that filled me then. It was a quiet settling like ash after fire. I went upstairs to pack. Each step on the staircase felt like a closing door. I opened the cedar trunk where I kept the old documents, the only place I ever stored the things that mattered. A folded letter from my late husband, my nursing license, and a file labeled First Mortgage Agreement, co-signed 2004. I stared at it. My name neatly printed, my signature right next to Natalie's and her ex-husband's. She had long forgotten, but I hadn't. I placed it gently into my bag, not as revenge, not yet. It was simply a reminder. I existed. I mattered. I wasn't invisible. As I zipped my suitcase, I heard the children laughing downstairs. They didn't know. They hugged me when I came down. I smiled at them through the burn in my throat. Natalie didn't even look up when I said goodbye. I stepped outside into the sunlight, and it felt like walking out of a courtroom where I had just lost a case I didn't even know I was defending. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. I stayed with an old friend that night, Delilah, from my years working in the hospital. She had a small 2-bedroom apartment above a florist shop on Maple Street. The walls smelled like eucalyptus, and every surface was covered with books or plants or memories. When I knocked, she hugged me like I hadn't left 20 years ago. She didn't ask questions at first, only said, "Stay as long as you need." I didn't cry. I think my tears had all dried up in the back seat of the cab when I left Natalie's driveway. What replaced them wasn't anger exactly. It was clarity. A strange sort of weightless realization that something had cracked, but I wasn't the one broken. That first night, Delilah poured me chamomile tea and didn't ask anything until my second cup. "What happened?" I told her slowly, the way you unwind a bandage after too long. About the words, about Natalie's face, about the silence that came after. And when I reached the part about the mortgage, the money, the document, I remember the way her eyebrows lifted. "You mean you co-signed it?" "No," I said quietly. "I paid it. Most of it. Quietly. Over 5 years." Delilah leaned back in her chair, the old wood creaking like an exclamation point. She doesn't know. She doesn't remember. And then she said something that changed the direction of my breath. You know what that makes you, Elle? What? A ghost. You were real enough to save her, and now you're invisible enough to ignore. The next morning, I went to the local credit union. It had been almost 15 years, but I still had the original records, the bank drafts, the statements, the payment stubs. I sat with a financial advisor, a young man named Greg, who looked like he hadn't been born when I took out the first CD that saved Natalie's down payment. I placed the folder on the table between us and opened it like it was a confession. I need you to help me understand if my name is still on the deed, and if there's a way to notify the lender of my interest. He raised an eyebrow but took it seriously. I watched his fingers dance across the keyboard searching public records. Then he stopped. Your name is listed as a silent co-owner, he said. It looks like the primary mortgage was paid off 5 years ago. That was your money. Yes. And your daughter refinanced recently. Took out a second mortgage 2 years ago. But your original ownership wasn't removed. She never filed a quitclaim. No, ma'am. He paused and looked at me carefully. You technically still own 50% of that house. It felt like standing up inside myself for the first time in years. He continued. If she's forcing you out and your name is still on the title, you have legal grounds. At minimum, you're entitled to notification, possibly occupation rights, maybe even restitution. But I didn't want restitution. I didn't want to sue my daughter. I just wanted her to see me, see what I had done, see what she had lost. That night, I sat in Delilah's guest room with a warm blanket and an old legal pad. I began writing, not to Natalie, not yet, but to the house, to the walls that had once held both our laughter, to the mortgage checks I mailed in silence, to the day I stood behind her at closing, letting her shine like I hadn't been the one to bring the light. I didn't know what I would do yet, but I knew what I wouldn't do: disappear. A week passed. I bought a burner phone and called the lender requesting the latest mortgage statement to be reissued to all owners at the official address. They confirmed the name, Eleanor Whitmore, still on file, still present, still legally real. That was all I needed. Delilah asked me what now. I looked out her window at the quiet town. I wait, I said. For what? For the moment the mail arrives. For her to open something she doesn't understand and realize it has my name on it. Sometimes you don't need to break down the door. You just wait for them to open it and find your name carved into the frame. It took 6 days. 6 days of waiting, of sipping tea with Delilah, of watching the sky shift from summer blue to a softer gray that made everything feel a bit more cinematic than real. In that time, I didn't call Natalie. I didn't text. I didn't want to give her a warning. Because the truth is, sometimes people don't deserve a gentle preface. Sometimes they need to be startled awake. On the 7th morning, the phone rang. Not mine, hers. Delilah handed it to me with a raised eyebrow. It's your daughter, I answered calmly. Eleanor, Natalie said. Not Mom. Just my name, like I was a stranger on a customer service call. I just got a letter from the bank. It has your name on it. Yes, I said. Why would they send you anything? There it was. The confusion, the discomfort, the tone of someone realizing their world might be built on an assumption they never questioned. I'm still on the deed, I said softly. You can't be. I am. Legally. Fully. And publicly. She was silent. Then came the coldness. Why now? Are you trying to punish me? I let the silence sit. And then, no, you're doing that yourself. Click. She hung up. I don't know what I expected. An apology. Maybe. An explosion. Possibly. But not that cold disconnection. Not that refusal to engage. I felt nothing. Not victory. Not sadness. Just an acknowledgement. This is who she has become. And maybe it took this moment for me to stop trying to find the daughter I remembered in the woman who had forgotten me. 2 more days passed. Then a formal letter arrived at Delilah's, Natalie's handwriting. It wasn't an apology, it was a legal request. A printed document asking if I'd be willing to relinquish any perceived stake in the property in exchange for a one-time settlement of $25,000. She wanted to buy me off, as if I were a contractor, a squatter, a ghost. I stared at the number. $25,000. I had poured more than 3 times that into the house over a decade ago, not including the groceries, the child care, the silent support when her marriage fell apart, the invisible shoulders she stood on to survive. I didn't call her. I called Greg, the young financial advisor. He reviewed the papers. Legally speaking, you're not just co-owner. You're a majority payer. If you wanted, you could reclaim occupancy, or even initiate a property split. I don't want the house, I said. I just want her to know what it cost. He nodded slowly. Then I suggest we send her something that reflects that. Together we drafted a document, a simple, dignified letter stating the original contributions, the dates, the records, all notarized, all signed, all facts. At the bottom, I wrote a single sentence in my own hand. This is not a threat. It's a mirror. I mailed it the next morning. Then I waited again. But this time, I waited differently. Not like someone hoping for redemption, but like someone watching the tide turn slow, silent, inevitable. I spent that week reorganizing Delilah's bookshelf, helping her prune her balcony garden, laughing with her over memories of long shifts at the hospital and cafeteria coffee. In between, I took long walks reclaiming something I hadn't felt in years. Peace that wasn't conditional on someone else's approval. Then came the call. It was her voice again, but this time, lower. Mom. A pause. A crack. A vulnerability. I didn't know you did all that. I didn't remember. I didn't want you to remember, I said. I wanted you to be better than that. Silence. Then, what happens now? That's up to you. I could hear her swallow on the line. I want you to come back. Please. I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure yet. Forgiveness, you see, isn't a door you can just walk through. Sometimes it's a bridge, and the person on the other side has to build their half before you step onto yours. That night, I opened my old journal and wrote one sentence. She finally saw the debt not in dollars, but in dignity. The invitation came a few days later, this time not through a phone call or a text, but a letter handwritten, folded neatly, tucked into a pale pink envelope with my name on the front. Mom. Inside was Natalie's handwriting, the loops and slants still familiar from birthday cards long past, though shakier now. Dear Mom. I read everything. I sat with it, and I wept. Not just because I forgot, but because I didn't even think to remember. You saved me more times than I can count. You were there when I needed everything, and I made you feel like nothing. I'm sorry. I truly am. The kids miss you. I miss you. Please come home. Attached was a second page, a copy of a deed correction form unsigned, and beneath that, a personal note scribbled in the corner. This time I won't erase you. I sat at Delilah's kitchen table for a long while with that letter. Her plants hung quietly around me like witnesses. The tea kettle hissed in the background. Delilah came in, saw the envelope, and didn't say a word. She simply set a small cup of lemon ginger tea beside me and sat down. Are you going? She finally asked. I don't know. What would going mean? That I forgive her. And what would staying mean? That I forgive myself. I didn't need to rush, but I did call Greg again. This time to draw up something else. Not a legal document. A personal one. I wanted to write something not to protect myself from Natalie, but to protect Natalie from forgetting again. I asked Greg to help me draft a letter that outlined everything I had contributed item by item. Not out of spite, but as history. I didn't want a plaque. I didn't want a name on a door. I just wanted the truth to live somewhere outside my heart. Then I went to the house. I didn't tell her I was coming. I wanted to see the house for what it was, not what she prepared it to be. It looked the same. The front porch still leaned slightly to the left. The flower pots were overwatered, the lawn undertrimmed. But it was home because it held both my labor and my love. Natalie opened the door with wide eyes and shaking hands. Mom? I nodded. Inside, the kids ran to me. My grandson held out a small drawing, a house with 2 stick figures on the porch. One was labeled me, the other Grandma. No one else. Just us. I missed you, he said. I kissed his head. I missed you too, sweet boy. Natalie stood back as if waiting for permission to speak. I handed her the envelope, the one with the breakdown of every contribution I had made. She took it and began to cry before she even opened it. I don't deserve your grace, she said. No, I replied softly. You don't. She winced. But I give it anyway. Not because you earned it, but because I choose not to carry the weight anymore. That was when I saw it. Not guilt, not pity, but understanding, the rare kind that only comes after you've looked at yourself in the mirror and hated what you saw and decided to become someone better. We spent the afternoon together. She made tea. We talked. She didn't beg, didn't deflect, didn't minimize. When I stood to leave, she asked, "Will you stay for dinner?" I paused. "I'm not ready to stay," I said, "but I'm ready to visit." She nodded. That night back at Delilah's, I journaled. Sometimes the house isn't what needs repairing. Sometimes it's the foundation between people that needs rebuilding brick by silent brick. And that rebuilding would take time. But at least now we had the blueprints. The next week unfolded like the slow turning of a forgotten page, familiar, fragile, but surprisingly full. Natalie didn't push. She didn't beg me to move back in. She just called every morning like clockwork. Simple things. "Good morning, Mom. Do you want to come by for lunch? Ethan's piano recital is this Friday." It was strange at first hearing her voice laced with humility instead of pride. Stranger still was how much I had longed for even these mundane exchanges. It reminded me of when she was a child, when she used to wake me up at 5 a.m. on Saturdays just to tell me a dream she had about flying or tigers or pancakes. Back then I was her whole world. And somewhere along the way, I became her furniture, useful, invisible, easy to ignore until you trip over it. But now she saw me again. I decided to attend Ethan's recital. Delilah helped me pick out a soft blue blouse and steam the creases from my skirt. She smiled at me as I dressed, her eyes kind but sharp. "You look like someone who remembered her worth," she said. The recital was held at a local community center. Families poured into the hall, chatting, shuffling programs, adjusting ties. Natalie was already there. She looked nervous, like a woman facing a mirror she hadn't seen in years. When she saw me, her shoulders eased. She didn't rush me. She simply took my hand and led me to a seat in the front row. Ethan played beautifully. His little fingers danced across the keys like he was tracing memories none of us could quite catch. When the final note rang out, he looked up. Not at the crowd, not at his teacher, but at me. And he smiled. After the applause, Natalie leaned over and whispered, "He practiced that piece just for you." The evening melted into dinner at her place. Nothing fancy, spaghetti, garlic bread, lemonade. But there was no tension, no forced cheer, only warmth, only possibility. When the kids went upstairs to get ready for bed, Natalie sat across from me with a small velvet box. "I found this when I was going through the drawer in the hallway," she said. She opened it. Inside was a necklace opal, small but elegant. My late husband had given it to me on our 25th anniversary. I had lost it during the move to Natalie's house all those years ago. I assumed it had been thrown out with one of the many unlabeled boxes. "You kept it?" I asked, stunned. She shook her head. "No, I think you kept it. I just never looked deep enough to find it." She placed it in my hand. "I want you to know," she said, voice trembling, "that I see you now. Fully. Not as an obligation or a helper, but as my mother, as the reason I have anything at all." Tears rose in my eyes, uninvited but welcomed. "Natalie," I said quietly, "you hurt me. Deeply. I know. You made me feel like I didn't exist." She nodded. "I'm so sorry." I looked at the necklace, then at her. "I believe you." It wasn't absolution, but it was a door. A door we had both locked years ago and now finally were opening again. As I stood to leave that night, she walked me to the door. She didn't ask me to stay. She simply said, "Whenever you're ready." And this time she meant it. Back at Delilah's, I hung the necklace on the mirror. Not because I wanted to wear it every day, but because it was a reminder that sometimes the things we think are lost are just waiting for us to see them again. Just like love, just like dignity, just like me. 2 weeks passed. I didn't rush back into the house, and Natalie didn't try to fast forward our healing. We moved like two people crossing a rickety bridge together, one careful step at a time, always checking the weight of the moment before moving forward. Delilah teased me every morning, "Still not packed." She'd smirk pouring our tea, and I'd smile back, still watching, because I wasn't ready yet. Not just to return to that house, but to trust again. Forgiveness, I had learned, is less about saying yes and more about watching for proof. Natalie had begun sending photos. Small things. A new flower bed she planted out front. Ethan's art project with the caption, "Grandma's house," scrawled in purple marker. A bookshelf she'd rearranged mine. She said, "The one with your medical journals and gardening books. I want it to be ready for you." One photo in particular froze me. It was of the kitchen. Clean. Empty. But on the refrigerator was a printed page. At first I thought it was a recipe, but zooming in I saw it. The list. The one Greg and I had put together. The itemized breakdown of everything I'd paid for the hidden mortgage payments, the utility bills, the grocery deliveries she never knew were from me. And at the top of the page, in her handwriting, paid not in dollars but in love. She had laminated it, not to shame herself, not to flatter me, but to remember. That was the moment something inside me softened. It wasn't just about being seen anymore. It was about being honored. That evening, I told Delilah I would be going back for a visit at least a weekend. She nodded, then handed me a small wooden box. Inside were her set of keys. "You'll always have two homes," she said. "One you made and one that made you whole again." I packed slowly. One suitcase, a book of pressed flowers, the opal necklace, and the folder with all the mortgage documents, not out of spite, but for memory. When I arrived at the house, Natalie was waiting at the door with a nervous smile. The kids ran past her and hugged me like a dam breaking. "Grandma, Grandma." They dragged me inside, showing off new toys, drawings, even a welcome home banner they had taped crooked and beautiful to the hallway wall. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt the same. Dinner was simple. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, a salad. But the table had an extra setting. For me. With the blue china she only used on holidays. We talked. About the kids. About her new position at work. About the flowers blooming in the backyard. She didn't overcompensate. She didn't beg for praise. She just let me be without guilt, without transaction, without trying to rewrite the past. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed and the dishes were done, she asked if I wanted to see something. She led me into her home office and opened a drawer. Inside were the original mortgage documents, my name still etched beside hers. She pointed to a freshly printed page next to them. A new co-ownership agreement. This time with my name in bold. Equal share, not because the law demanded it, because she did. "I don't need anything from you, Mom," she said. "I just want to make sure no one ever forgets what you've done." I touched the paper. Then I touched her hand. And for the first time in years, she didn't flinch. She held it. Firm. Honest. Present. "I'm not ready to move back in," I said quietly. She nodded. "I know, but I'm ready for you to." Before I left, she walked me out to the porch. The same spot where she once ignored me with a glass of wine in her hand. Now she simply whispered, "Thank you for not disappearing." I turned to her and said, "Thank you for finally looking." And with that, I walked into the evening not as a guest, not as a burden, but as a mother reclaimed. The next morning, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The same porch where I had once stood invisible, holding on to the last shreds of my dignity. Now the light fell gently across my lap, and the quiet hum of the neighborhood wrapped around me like a memory trying to make amends. Natalie joined me with her own mug coffee, still too sweet, like she'd always taken it. She didn't speak at first. She just sat beside me, letting the stillness stretch between us like a fragile bridge. "I had a dream last night," she finally said. "Oh." I was small again. Maybe 10. "You were tucking me in. I asked you if monsters were real." I chuckled softly. "What did I say?" "You said, not the kind you see in books. But people can become monsters when they forget how to love." Ah. I looked at her. She looked older than I remembered. Not physically, but emotionally. Like someone who'd walked through fire and realized the smoke was coming from within. "I think I forgot," she whispered. "You did," I said. "No sugarcoating, no soft landing. But you remembered again. That counts." She turned toward me, eyes brimming. "I still don't know why you didn't scream at me, or cut me off, or humiliate me back." I smiled. "Because I wasn't raised that way. And neither were you. Somewhere under all that pride, you're still the girl who braided my hair when I had migraines." Natalie looked down at her hands. "I miss that girl. She's still in there. And I see her again now." That evening, we went through old photo albums together. Some had faded, others were sticky with time. We laughed at Natalie's bowl haircut, the mismatched outfits I used to dress her in, the birthday cakes with lopsided candles. There was one picture I paused on. It was her first day of college. She stood in front of the dorm beaming while I held 2 suitcases and a grocery bag full of snacks. I remembered how proud I was, how I'd driven 12 hours just to help her move in, slept in the car, and drove home the next morning for a nursing shift. I hadn't thought about that day in years, but in that moment I realized I had always been the foundation, not the spotlight, not the voice, the silent stone beneath her steps. Natalie reached for the photo and held it to her chest. I don't think I ever thanked you for that day. You didn't need to. Back then I thought love didn't require receipts. She nodded slowly. And now I think love doesn't require receipts, but memory does. We spent that night in easy silence. She made up the guest bedroom with fresh sheets and a new lamp. Not an apology, an invitation. And though I didn't stay that night, I knew I would someday. Back at Delilah's, I stood by the window and looked out at the quiet street. I think I'm almost ready, I told her. She smiled as she folded laundry. Ready to move back. Maybe not fully, but ready to forgive. And maybe ready to belong there again. Delilah hugged me. You never stopped belonging, Eleanor. They just stopped remembering. The next morning, I wrote a letter. To myself, Dear Eleanor, you are not a burden. You are a builder, a giver, a mother whose silence carved space for love. You deserve to be remembered long before now, and yet you still chose to love anyway. That is your legacy, not the hurt. I folded the letter and tucked it into my journal. Not to send, not to frame, but to keep, because sometimes the hardest person to forgive isn't the one who wronged you. It's the one who let herself forget what she was worth. 1 week later, I stood at the edge of the garden behind Natalie's house, my fingers brushing the leaves of the rosemary bush I had planted years ago. It had grown wild, pushing past its original boundaries, just like life tends to do when no one's looking. I was here again, not as a guest, not as an intruder, but as someone returning. Natalie came out with a pair of shears and a hopeful expression. Do you want to help me trim it back? I nodded. Let it be wild for now. It earned it. She smiled, and we sat together on the back steps. The kids were inside watching some cartoon that made the walls vibrate with laughter. It was peaceful in that moment. The kind of peace that comes after you've wept, after the storm has spoken its piece, and retreated. I filed the deed transfer, she said suddenly quietly. I turned to her, eyebrows raised. You didn't have to. I did, because you did everything first. And I want that to be written somewhere more permanent than memory. She pulled out a manila folder and handed it to me. Inside was a revised co-ownership agreement notarized and filed. My name stood beside hers in print so bold it felt like a spotlight. I stared at it for a long moment, blinking back something I hadn't expected: grief. Grief for all the years when I could have been celebrated instead of tolerated. For the quiet meals I ate alone in her house while she laughed on the phone in the next room. For the times I stitched buttons onto her children's jackets while she forgot I'd even taken them off the hanger. But also, relief, because something had changed. Tangibly, legally, emotionally. You're sure? I asked. She nodded. Mom, I was blind. I didn't even want to look. But now I can't not see you. And I never want you to feel unseen again. We talked for a while about what the next step looked like. I told her I wasn't ready to move in fully, not yet. I had grown to love my mornings with Delilah, my walks through the quiet streets, my own rhythm. But I agreed to stay weekends, to rebuild slowly, to try. That afternoon, the kids and I made banana bread. The kitchen buzzed with soft music and the smell of cinnamon. Ethan spilled flour everywhere. Natalie came in with paper towels and a smile, not a sigh. And when the timer dinged, she pulled the loaf from the oven, looked at me, and said, Will you do the honors? I sliced it carefully. I had fed this family in 1,000 invisible ways. This time the gesture was seen, celebrated. Later that evening, Natalie brought me a small gift bag. Inside was a new set of gardening gloves and a leather-bound planner. I know you love your lists, she said, a little embarrassed. Maybe we can plant something together this spring? I opened the planner. Inside on the first page she had written in careful print, "To the woman who made this house a home before anyone else noticed. This time I'll never forget." I didn't speak. Some moments are too full for words. That night back at Delilah's, I placed the deed copy in my drawer. Not as a weapon, not as leverage, as a reminder that love when remembered becomes legacy, and memory when honored becomes justice. I wrote in my journal, "There is no perfect way to fix a fractured bond. Only the choice to begin again without pretending the cracks never happened. Let them stay. Let them show. That's where the light gets in." I closed the journal, turned off the light, and lay down to sleep finally in a peace that was mine. It was a Sunday morning when I walked into the kitchen and found a vase of fresh tulips on the table. A little note was tucked inside. "For Mom, just because today exists and so do you. Natalie." It was strange how something so small could feel like a tectonic shift. Years ago, I had placed flowers in that exact spot every Monday morning without fail. Tulips when I could afford them, daffodils from the neighbor's yard when I couldn't. No one ever said a word. Now here they were again. But this time, someone remembered. That morning, Natalie asked if we could go for a walk. Just us. The kids stayed behind with their tablets and leftover banana bread. We walked slowly down the tree-lined street, arms brushing but not quite linked. She was quiet for a long time before finally speaking. "Do you ever resent me?" I looked at her. Her face was open, vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen in decades. "Sometimes," I said honestly. "But it's not a fire anymore. It's a scar. It doesn't scream. It just reminds." She nodded, as if she had been expecting that answer. "I've been going to therapy," she said. "Since that day, the day I told you to leave." I stopped walking. "You never told me." "I wasn't ready to. I was too ashamed." She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I've learned that what I did was emotional neglect. That I treated you like a utility, a fixture. I never saw the cost of your presence, only the convenience." I took a deep breath. It felt like we were both walking through an invisible doorway. "Do you believe people can change?" she asked. "I believe they can choose to," I replied. "And I believe you're choosing to." She smiled then. It wasn't the smug smile of someone trying to patch over guilt. It was the soft, tentative smile of someone trying to become whole again. We walked a little farther. There was a bench beneath a blooming dogwood tree. We sat there side by side like we used to when she was in middle school, and would sit in my lap crying about a lost friendship or a bad grade. "I found something else," she said. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo. It was of a handwritten card I had left in her lunchbox when she was 16. "You don't need to be perfect. You just need to be kind. And you already are. Love, Mom." "I forgot I even had this," she whispered. "I found it in an old keepsake box when I was looking for your necklace." I laughed gently. "You kept it." She nodded. "I think somewhere inside I always knew what you meant to me. I just let adulthood drown it out." The wind picked up and scattered the petals around our feet. "You know, I said life is like gardening. Sometimes we forget to water the most important roots. But if they're deep enough, they'll hold on until we remember." She leaned her head on my shoulder. "I want to make new roots with you." "You already have," I said. "They're growing between every word you've said since you remembered me." That afternoon, back at the house, we cooked dinner together. No special occasion. No holiday. Just the two of us in the kitchen, the rhythm of our movements familiar and steady. She let me take the lead. My recipes, my spices, my way of folding the kitchen towels, just so. And when the kids came down, they'd join the dance. Setting the table, lighting the candle Natalie had once told me was too fancy for weeknights. We sat. We ate. We laughed about silly things, the way Ethan hates green beans but devours spinach. How Natalie once got locked out of her college dorm in a towel. And somewhere in that laughter I realized I was home. Not just in a building I'd helped pay for, but in a space I had helped shape, now finally acknowledged. After dinner, Natalie brought out a cake. Nothing fancy, store-bought, slightly lopsided. But the frosting said in careful piping, "To the woman who made this family possible." I didn't cry. Not then. Instead, I stood, looked around the table, and raised my glass of sparkling water. "To memory," I said. "To gratitude," Natalie echoed. "To the kind of love that grows even when you forget to water it," I added. We clinked glasses. And in that moment, I felt something settle inside me, like a puzzle piece finally finding its home. The following weekend, I returned to Delilah's, not because I needed distance, but because I needed to honor the quiet sanctuary that had sheltered me when no one else had. Delilah met me at the door with her usual wry smile. "You smell like forgiveness," she teased, ushering me in. "Do I?" I chuckled. "Yeah. And garlic. Did Natalie let you cook again?" She asked me to. Delilah's eyes sparkled. "Good. Took her long enough." We sat down with tea like always. But this time, I had more to offer than silence. I told her about the co-ownership papers, the necklace, the cake. I told her about the bench beneath the dogwood tree and Natalie's whispered apology. I told her that it still hurt but it didn't sting. That I could finally breathe in that house. That I wasn't invisible anymore. Delilah listened without interruption, hands folded on her lap, the way only true friends know how to do. After I finished, she reached under the coffee table and pulled out a small box. "I was saving this for when you decided," she said. Inside was a brass key attached to a leather fob that simply read, "For when you want to come home to yourself." I held it carefully. "You're giving me a key?" Delilah smiled. "No, darling. I'm returning it. It was always yours. You just forgot." I didn't cry. Not then. But my fingers curled tight around the key as if it might evaporate if I let go. We spent the evening in easy company. No emotional reckonings. No soul-bearing confessions. Just two women who'd walked through storms now sitting in the calm. The next morning, I took a walk. Through the quiet streets. Past the florist shop where children pointed at bouquets too big for their hands. Past the bookstore where I used to sit and read gardening magazines circling herbs I'd never plant. I ended up at a small bench near the fountain. There, I pulled out a small notepad and began to write. Not a journal entry, not a letter to Natalie, but a list. Things I want to remember. I mattered even when I was forgotten. Silence is powerful, but truth is louder. Sacrifice doesn't need to be seen to be real. Love without boundaries becomes erasure. I am not a burden. I am a woman who built more than a home. I deserve joy that isn't borrowed. I forgave her because I love her, not because I owe her. Healing takes root in truth, not comfort. My legacy is not what I gave, but what I reclaimed. I folded the page and slipped it into my purse. Later that afternoon, Natalie called. "Mom, we're doing brunch next Sunday. Will you come?" "I'd love to." "There's something else." I was thinking, would you be willing to tell the kids about how you helped build the house? They're old enough now to understand, and I think it's important they know. I was stunned. Not because of the request, but because of the recognition. Natalie didn't just want to remember, she wanted to pass it down. "Of course," I said, voice thick. "I'd be honored." The next Sunday, I sat on the patio with Ethan and Maddie, pointing to the house as I told them stories. About the time I painted the hallway with a brush so small it took me 2 days. About the night I paid the mortgage bill while Natalie slept upstairs, heartbroken from her divorce. About the days I folded their onesies and whispered prayers into the fabric. They listened. Not with glazed-over eyes, but with real wide wonder. And when I finished, Ethan said, "Grandma, that means this is kind of your house too, right?" I smiled. "Yes, sweetheart. In more ways than one." Natalie came outside holding 3 cups of lemonade. She sat beside me, looked at the kids, then said, "It's her house because she built this family, even when we didn't see it." I didn't need the lemonade. Her words were enough to quench something that had long been parched inside me. That evening, when I returned to Delilah's, I stood at the mirror with the opal necklace around my neck. I looked at myself not as a shadow of someone's mother or an accessory to someone else's life, but as a woman who had remembered her worth, reclaimed her space, and rewritten her ending. Not loud, not bitter, but with grace. Autumn came slowly that year. The kind of autumn that didn't announce itself with winds or storms, but with light golden mornings and trees that hesitated before letting go. I found myself back at Natalie's more often. First weekends, then Wednesdays. Then I simply stopped marking the calendar. She never once asked, "Are you moving back in?" Instead, she created space deliberately, respectfully, like someone preparing a room for a guest they hoped would stay, but would never pressure. One morning, I found a small wooden plaque hanging in the guest bedroom. It read, You were never a guest. I stood there for a long while, touching the smooth wood, reading it over and over. She hadn't told me she'd put it there. She didn't need to. Later that day, I opened the linen closet and found it immaculately arranged. Towels folded the way I liked them, longside in color gradient from top to bottom. That detail told me everything. Natalie had been watching. She had been learning, not out of guilt, out of love. That evening over dinner, Natalie cleared her throat and said, "Mom, I talked to the kids about the deed." I raised an eyebrow. I explained that this house wouldn't be here if it weren't for you, that it's as much yours as mine, and that one day when it passes down, your name stays on it. I set down my fork. You didn't have to. I wanted to. I need them to grow up knowing the difference between taking and inheriting, between assuming and appreciating. Her voice cracked. I don't want to raise kids who forget. A deep, aching warmth filled my chest, the kind of warmth that felt like a second chance. Later, as I tucked Maddie into bed, she whispered, "Grandma, did Mommy hurt your feelings?" I paused. A little yes. She looked guilty. "But she said sorry, right?" "She did." "And you still love her?" "Of course." She smiled. "Okay, then it's fixed." I kissed her forehead, blinking away tears. It was that simple. To a child, healing was just two people trying again. Back in the hallway, I found Natalie waiting. She looked at me with that fragile vulnerability I now knew by heart. "I still don't know how you didn't scream at me," she whispered. "Because I was too tired," I said honestly, "and because I knew screaming wouldn't teach you anything." Silence did. She nodded slowly. I heard it louder than any words. The next weekend, we hosted a family dinner, just us and a few close friends. Natalie insisted I sit at the head of the table. I tried to protest, but she placed her hand gently on my shoulder. "Please. For all the times you sat at the corner unseen." So I did. We laughed. We shared stories. We passed plates heavy with food and heavier with memory. At one point, Natalie raised her glass and said, "To my mother, Eleanor, the woman who paid for this roof, built these walls with her love, and taught me how to fix what I've broken. I love you." There was no applause, just silence, and then the clink of glasses. It was more powerful than a standing ovation. That night, after the guests had left and the house had gone quiet, I stood in the doorway of my old room. Natalie came behind me and said, "I had a contractor look at the basement. Thought maybe we could make it into a library for you. A quiet space. Yours." I turned to her, stunned. "I don't need that." "I know," she smiled. "But I want you to have it. Because you always gave us everything and never asked for anything back." I nodded, overwhelmed. And for the first time, I said something I hadn't dared in years. "I think I'm ready to come home. Not just visit, not just test the waters, but return." Natalie exhaled one of those long, relieved breaths that comes from waiting for something you didn't think you deserved. "I'm glad," she whispered. "Me too." As I unpacked my things later that night, I reached into the side pocket of my suitcase and pulled out Delilah's key. I placed it gently in the top drawer of the nightstand, not because I didn't need it anymore, but because now I had two places that held me. And for the first time in a long time, I had space in my heart for both. The library and the basement came together faster than I expected. Natalie insisted on managing the renovation herself. "I owe you at least one act of service," she joked, standing in a paint-splattered t-shirt, wielding a measuring tape like it was a sword of redemption. We picked out the wallpaper together, a soft floral print with muted sage and cream tones. Elegant, quiet. We chose oak shelves instead of white. "Wood remembers," I said. Natalie nodded. "Like you." Each book I had kept in boxes for years, gardening manuals, old nursing texts, novels annotated in the margins, finally had a home again. A quiet corner, a reading chair by the window. Well, a place just for me. But more than that, Natalie built the room with her hands. Not with hired help, not for show, for love. When it was finished, she stood in the doorway and asked, "Do you like it?" "I don't like it," I said softly. "I feel seen in it." And I did. That little room was more than 4 walls and a chair. It was a monument to every quiet sacrifice I'd made in that house. And now finally it was mine. One afternoon, while I was organizing the shelves, Maddie came in holding a drawing. "This is for your room, Grandma." She handed me a picture of a tree with deep roots and bright leaves. At the base, 2 stick figures. Me and you. I like that the tree has strong roots, she said proudly. It does, I said, because it had to hold up a lot. She grinned. Like you. I placed it right above my desk. That evening we had dinner as a family, Natalie, the kids, and me. Nothing grand. Pasta again. But halfway through, Natalie asked, "Do you remember the first dinner you made in this house?" I blinked. "You mean for you and Ryan?" She nodded. "It was chicken and lemon potatoes. You brought it in Tupperware because we didn't even have a working oven yet." I smiled. "I remember. You both looked like you hadn't slept in days." She laughed. "We hadn't, but you fed us anyway, even when we were too proud to ask." "I never needed you to ask," I said. "I know that now," she whispered. After the kids went to bed, we stayed at the table sipping tea. "Mom." "Yes. If I had never remembered, never woken up to what you did, what would you have done?" I thought about it. Eventually, I would have disappeared. Not in bitterness, but in exhaustion. She looked down, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm sorry I brought you that close to giving up." "You didn't bring me there, Natalie," I said gently. "I walked there myself, out of love, out of hope, but also out of self-erasure. That part, that's on me." She looked stunned. "You're blaming yourself." "No," I said. "I'm owning it." Forgiveness is a two-way street, and sometimes the hardest person to forgive is the version of ourselves that stayed too long in silence. She reached across the table and took my hand. And sometimes she said the greatest thing a mother does is survive her own kindness long enough to be honored for it. We sat in that silence, 2 women, 2 mothers, now finally speaking to each other as equals. Later that night, as I sat in my new reading chair, I looked at the bookshelf beside me. There, on the top shelf, Natalie had placed a framed photo of the house. Underneath, in her handwriting, it read, "Built by love, paid in silence, remembered forever." I closed my eyes and exhaled. This was no longer a house I once helped build. It was a home that had finally found the room to hold me in return. Fall deepened. Leaves fell in slow spirals, blanketing the backyard in gold and rust. The garden I'd once tended quietly was now alive again, not because of my hands, but because Natalie had started caring for it. She still didn't do it perfectly. She overwatered the lavender and forgot to prune the hydrangeas. But it wasn't about precision anymore. It was about presence, and for the first time, that was enough. We had developed a rhythm, a shared silence that didn't ache anymore, a kind of peace that settled not through apology, but through the humble repetition of respect. One afternoon, Natalie came into the basement library while I was reading and held up a stack of letters. "They're for you," she said. "From people you helped when you were working. I found them in a box marked Old Mail." I took the stack, my fingers brushing paper I hadn't touched in decades. Handwritten notes from former patients, co-workers, even one from a janitor at the hospital, thanking me for bringing him soup the day his wife died. I read them in silence, the words sinking into me like warmth after years in the cold. "You never told me about any of this," Natalie said. "You weren't listening," I replied. "But maybe I wasn't speaking either." She knelt beside the chair, eyes searching mine. "I want to hear now." So I told her stories, not just about the people I helped, but about who I was, what I feared, what I loved, what I lost. I told her about the miscarriage I never shared, the poetry I used to write, but never showed, the days I considered leaving everything behind, but stayed because someone needed a sandwich or a shoulder or just a look of kindness. She cried, not loudly, just enough. And when I finished, she whispered, "Why didn't you let us carry any of that for you?" I smiled, tired and gentle. "Because no one ever offered, and I didn't know I could ask." The next day, I found a small notebook on my nightstand. The front said, "Your stories matter." Inside, Natalie had begun writing down things I'd said. Quotes, memories, fragments of the past. She was building a record, not of guilt, not of debt, but of legacy. That Sunday at dinner, Ethan said something that froze time. "Grandma, did you know Mom says you're the strongest person she's ever met?" I blinked. "I didn't." Natalie looked down, flushed. I told him the truth. After dinner, we all went outside to rake leaves. It was chaos. Children jumping into piles, we just gathered laughter echoing into the fading daylight. And then, unprompted, Natalie said, "Mom, will you come with me to the notary this week?" "For what?" She hesitated. "I'm updating my will, and I want it to reflect everything, including you." I swallowed hard. Not because I needed anything, but because the gesture meant everything. Later that evening, as I lay in bed beneath the quilt my mother had once sewn, I felt the weight of decades lift from my chest. Not all of it. Not forever. But enough. I got up, went to my desk in the library, and pulled out that same notepad I'd written in weeks ago. This time I added one more line. 11. I am no longer forgotten. I tore the page out, folded it carefully, and slid it into the back of the family photo album upstairs. Because stories aren't just told, they're remembered. And sometimes the most powerful legacy isn't money or houses or heirlooms. It's the decision to tell the truth, even when no one asked. Thanksgiving arrived with the kind of quiet beauty that seemed almost deliberate, as if the sky itself had agreed to soften, to hold space for something healing. It was the first holiday we spent together in years. Truly together, no tension under the table. No brittle smiles for the sake of the children. No unspoken rules about where I could sit or how long I could stay. Natalie insisted I carve the turkey. "You've earned it," she said, handing me the carving knife. "I think I earned it 20 years ago," I teased. She laughed, a real one, then added, "Well, then this is just overdue interest." We all sat at the table, the kids fidgeting with excitement, Natalie fussing over rolls that were already perfect, and me, sitting at the head without protest. It was the same table where I once sat unnoticed. The same house where I once whispered through my usefulness. And now it was the place where my voice returned. Not as noise, not as echo, but as center. During dessert, Natalie tapped her glass and stood. "I want to say something." She began, her voice trembling slightly. "Today isn't just about giving thanks for what we have. It's about acknowledging how we got it. And for this family, that path leads directly through one woman." She turned to me. "My mother. The reason we had a home before I even knew what a mortgage was. The person who fed us, raised us, forgave us even when we didn't deserve it. She didn't ask for recognition, so she didn't get any. But today we changed that." The room was silent. Even the kids were still. Natalie continued, "I want this family to live with intentional memory, the kind that sees beyond the now. I want my children to know that everything they enjoy today was bought with more than money. It was bought with quiet, grace sacrifice, and a kind of love that most people never learn to carry." She turned to me fully now. "Mom, this family isn't just grateful for you. It's built on you." I couldn't speak. Ethan stood and handed me something small, a locket. Inside was a tiny folded note. I opened it with shaking hands. "Dear Grandma, if our house is a story, you are the first page. Love, Ethan." Tears came fast this time. Not from pain, not from longing, but from being seen, fully, finally. Later that evening, I stepped out onto the porch alone. The air was crisp, the stars gentle. Natalie joined me after a while, wrapping a shawl around my shoulders like I used to do for her after soccer practice. We stood there in silence, our breath fogging in the cold. "Are you happy?" she asked. I thought about it. Truly, deeply. "I'm becoming," I said. "That's better than happy. It means I'm not done yet." She leaned her head against mine. "And neither am I." We watched the wind carry leaves down the sidewalk, spiraling in quiet loops like time folding in on itself. In that moment, I didn't feel old. I didn't feel used. I didn't feel like a burden. I felt whole. The next morning, I wrote another entry in my notebook. 12. The past cannot be undone, but it can be answered. With grace, with change, with truth. I closed the notebook and slid it back into the drawer of my desk. Because I knew now, this wasn't just my story anymore. It was ours. And the rest of it we would write together. Winter arrived in whispers, thin frost on the windows, slower mornings, thicker socks, and deeper reflections. Natalie's home was warm, not just in temperature, but in tone. There was a softness to everything now, a kindness that had taken root like ivy crawling back up old brick. I had moved in fully by then, quietly, no announcement, no fanfare, One day my books were on the shelf. The next, my robe was hanging on the bathroom door. By the third week, even the kettle whistled at the exact hour I liked my tea. It wasn't the same home I had left, and I wasn't the same woman who had walked out carrying a bag of folded silence and unspent grief. One evening, just before Christmas, Natalie found me in the basement library. I was journaling beneath the soft reading lamp wrapped in the quilt I once brought for her when she was sick in college. She stood in the doorway holding a worn manila envelope. "I found this in my closet," she said. "I think you should be the one to open it." Inside were photos. Old ones. Faded. Curled at the edges. Me holding baby Natalie on a sagging couch. Me signing papers at the bank in 2004. Receipts. Copies of checks. All the fragments of what I had done stuffed away in the back of her closet like forgotten proof. "I don't know why I kept them," she said. "I think some part of me always knew. I just didn't want to admit how much I needed you." I held the photos carefully like they might tear from the weight of memory. "You kept them," I said softly. "That's all that matters." We sat down together on the rug, flipping through decades of evidence. Not of debt, but of devotion. She paused on one photo, her and I at the garden gate, both laughing at something the camera hadn't captured. "I want to frame this one," she said. "Put it in the hallway." I looked at her. "You sure? I want people to know where their roots are." The next day we had a small gathering, just a few close friends, the kids and Delilah, who arrived with cranberry scones and a face full of pride. At one point, Ethan stood in front of the fireplace and announced, "My grandma built this house with invisible bricks." Everyone laughed, but I didn't correct him, because he was right. After dinner, Natalie and I stayed behind to clean. She hummed as she washed dishes. And when we finished, she turned to me and said, "I want to ask you something." I braced myself. "If anything ever happens to me," she said, "I want you to keep this house. Not just legally, emotionally. I want the kids to grow up knowing it's yours just as much as mine." I blinked. "You don't need to ask me that." "I do," she said, "because you already gave me so much, and I want to give you something by choice, not by guilt." I didn't answer her right away. I walked upstairs, opened my notebook, and wrote one final entry. "13. The greatest justice is not revenge, it is remembrance." I closed the book. The next morning, I left something on Natalie's pillow, a letter in my handwriting. "Dear Natalie, you hurt me deeply, but you also chose to become someone who could repair that hurt piece by piece. That is rare. That is sacred. I stayed because I remembered you. You kept me because you finally remembered me. I forgive you not because I have to, but because I want to, and because forgiveness when earned becomes freedom for both of us. Let's continue writing our story. Together. Love. Mom." And then I returned to the library, sat in my chair, and watched the sun rise through the basement window. Not behind bars, not beneath someone else's roof, but in my home, because I was no longer a burden. I was the foundation. I always had been. Some debts are paid in silence. Some legacies are never carved in marble, but written in the quiet, unseen moments that hold a family together. This story isn't about money. It isn't even about forgiveness. It's about remembrance. About what happens when someone forgotten is finally seen, not as a footnote, not as background, but as the beating heart of the home. Eleanor never needed to be repaid. She needed to be recognized. And Natalie's transformation wasn't instant, nor was it perfect. But it was real. In a world that often forgets the sacrifices of older women, this story is a reminder. The strongest people in the room are often the quietest. And the deepest roots belong to those who stayed, who carried, who built. So if you're watching this and thinking of your mother, your grandmother, or someone whose love you've taken for granted, call her, thank her, remember her. Because nothing is heavier than the weight of a forgotten grace, and nothing is more powerful than a memory that finally finds its name. Now it's your turn. So before you go, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Grace's Truth, because the world needs more stories where the quiet ones finally speak.